I've kind of thought a bit about why we feel nostalgia. When you think about it, for the vast majority of human history, life did not change in any meaningful way with humans. Like, your father lived the same life that his father lived, that their grandfather lived. We were in a steady state culturally. And I think that's pretty inarguable that that's what we came from. Really, in a lot of ways, this only stopped 100 to maybe 200 years ago max. So I think humans have this instinct that, like, there's just something in us, at least in some of us, where we, in some primordial way, kind of realize that things shouldn't be changing as quickly as they are. The idea that the world you grew up in, no matter how old you are, the idea that the world you personally grew up in is different from the world today is something that 90% of our ancestors could not even imagine. We're always doing this weird thing where we think modernity is normal, but we live in by far the most abnormal era of history. So yeah, a lot of times when I'm driving out on these country roads away from everything, there's just something about it that feels consistent and familiar, I think, because for the most part, these roads out in the country are the same as they've always been for my entire life. They look the same. Driving on them is the same. And there's something about that almost does make me nostalgic, because very few parts of life are like that. Yeah, the hyper novelty that we live with, I think of it as just one of the ultimate double-edged swords, because it's super amazing in a lot of ways. We've eliminated diseases like polio and mumps and stuff like that. I actually got scarlet fever when I was a kid, which was so strange. But it's like you kind of see this process we went through where it's almost inevitable that a lot of our social fabric and common understandings and stuff were going to get destroyed, because the world we're living in, I mean, it's more complex than this, but one thing is the world we're living in changes so much. It's hard to have sort of norms and customs and things like that, cultural norms, in a culture that is just constantly changing. Another real problem with hyper novelty is, like, one aspect of morality that's fairly universal is, like, anytime you're valuing something that's more long-term over something that's more short-term, that's generally sort of moral, and the opposite tends to be sort of immoral. To take a basic example, the easiest way to get a TV is to break into your neighbor's house and take their TV if you have no money. If you don't have any money and you want a TV, what you have to do is get a job and save up some money, and eventually you can buy a TV. This analogy is getting a little old because TVs are getting cheaper and cheaper. When I was growing up, buying a TV was a big deal, so whatever. Now the connection there is, if we live in a culture that is constantly changing, that means that we can predict a lot less. We can anticipate a lot less because we have less certainty that the future will be like the past. In fact, at this point, we are extremely certain that the future will not be like the past. So the moral hazard to this is it's going to make us have to think more short term by definition, at least in some ways. One of the things that's really great about philosophy and ethics and these sorts of things is, like, moral principles and stuff are things that do not change, So even if the future is going to look really strange and different the whole point of discovering those principles is, even though maybe how it manifests might look different, these are unchanging principles and always have been. But a lot of people aren't going to understand abstract concepts and be able to get their minds around it. So yeah, that is kind of the double-edged sword of modernity. Even though a lot of problems get solved and stuff, man, there are all kinds of problems that are associated with just having an extremely hyper-novel world that we live in. I mean, that might actually be one of the better arguments against the idea or the theory of moral progress. There's a lot of people that think that moral progress is sort of inevitable, like people are going to become more moral. Perhaps a somewhat solid argument against that is just that progress itself inhibits people's proclivity to be moral, because it makes any kind of technological or whatever progress, any kind of progress that fundamentally alters society a lot, makes the future more difficult to anticipate. And if people can't sort of anticipate the future as easily as they once did, it's harder to think long term, and long term thinking is pretty inherent to morality. I don't want to make it like I'm 100% convinced of this. It's just a thought that recurs to me, and it does seem like there really might be something there. Really, it's more like a recurring fear, I would say.